When you get into this chapter, in chapter 7, as Kelly's been preaching through the rest of the book, you get to some hard subjects, and definitely not everybody's favorite subject to preach or teach on, because there's a lot of things that you go, wow, this is heavy, or this is a lot, or what is going on? Why does Paul say this? And you can flip back and forth. And so we're still in Corinthians chapter 7, a call to unity and purity in the church. I did not make slides, but if they have the scriptures, they can bring them up. I'm not deviating from chapter 7, so you don't have to turn or go anywhere else. But as Paul writes to the Corinthians, he's responding to a letter they wrote him. This is new believers. This is people who are now joining the church. They're in the midst of a culture that was a pagan society. It was the melting pot there, right? It's just outside of Athens, I think like 80 miles. I don't know. They say just outside, but it's a long distance. So this culture is a pinnacle. It's right on the sea. It's on the land. All the people travel through it. There's lots of trade going on, and there's lots of idol worship. There's a lot of things happening here. At this point, the Christian church is expanding, but also dealing with all the repercussions and persecution. And so you have all of this going on as Paul is talking to these people. And he says in verse 1, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." Now, if you preach any of this chapter out of context, by the way, or just pick one verse, this goes really weird. So I don't want to stop there, but he says it's not good for you to touch a woman, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman to have her own husband. So in their culture, they have the false gods, they have all these temples, they have temple prostitutes, they have weird relationships going on. So there are people that are in sexual immorality, and Paul says, you wrote about this, let me explain. It is not good for this relationship, right? It's not good to have this going on. And so he's telling them, you should be married by God's covenant. This is the only place for this type of relationship. It's not good to have this immorality. It's good for a woman to have a husband and a husband to have a wife. And the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except for the agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because you lack self-control. But I say this in a way of concession, not of command. Now, as Paul says this, each husband should have their wife, and each wife should have their husband. He's dealing with the immorality of this culture. And here's the other thing that was happening besides the immorality. They were expecting Jesus to come back today. In their time, they expected Jesus to come back. And so what was happening is you have these spouses that are going, I don't need to be with my spouse in any manner because God is coming back, and we only need to focus on the Lord, and we need to do these things, which was causing harm to marital relationships. And so this is important to see that Paul is dealing with this in a way to say, yes, there's impurity in our culture, but there's also a standard that God set for a husband and wife. And the two, as it says in Genesis, shall become one. And this should happen. Now there should be a time of prayer and a time of things, but the body belongs to the spouse. And this is important because, like I said, they were trying to deviate from things and saying, yeah, we're married, but our married life doesn't matter because Jesus is coming today. If he shows up, we got to be ready. We got to be doing the things of God. Or, as he gets later in the chapter, it was an unbelieving husband and a believing wife, or a believing husband and an unbelieving wife, and they were depriving each other, or there was conflict. And so Paul gets into this argument and says, Satan is going to tempt you and cause you to have lack of self-control, which will send you back into the culture to do the prostitution with these false people and get into things that you're not supposed to. So Paul said, guard your marriage. As that's what he's putting out before them. He says, yet I wish that all men were as myself, as how I am. However, each man in his own gift from God, one manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them to remain even as I am. So Paul makes this statement. He says, as I'm unmarried, it's better for you to be unmarried. Don't go get married. Here's the interesting thing. Paul was probably married at some point. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. To be a Pharisee, you had to have a wife. At some point, he converts to Christianity. We don't know if his wife died. We don't know if his wife said, I'm not following Jesus. I'm leaving you. We don't know. But Paul was married at some point, and he finds himself not married. And he says, it is better to stay in this position. And the reason is he's getting into the purity of the culture, saying you have time to worship God and focus on God and the things of God instead of the things of this world. So he doesn't want people to get married. He says it's better to stay this way. That's what he says. It's better to stay this way. What's interesting, though, in chapter 9, Paul makes another argument. He says, even if I want to get married, shouldn't I have the right? And so I don't know if Paul was even conflicted on this, but here he says, unmarried widows, it is good for them to remain even as I. And he makes this claim after saying, marriage is important. Marriage is not important. Focus on God. Is he contradicting himself? By no means. Paul in this moment is saying, God knows where you're at, and you need to do the things God commanded you where you're at in this position. It says, yet I wish that all men were even as myself am, however, each man has his own gift from God. So Paul is mixing this marriage symbol with gifts of God and saying, God has given you something for his glory, right, and for you to use. And he goes on this manner and yet one to another, but I say the unmarried widow that it is good for them to remain. Verse 9, but if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. God does not want us in a position that's going to cause us to sin. He doesn't want us to miss out on things of this world that are good that he created. But at the same time, if we can focus on God, he wants us there. Now, this is a hard chapter because some of you have been married for a long time. Some of you may be newlywed. Some of you may have had a spouse die. Some of you may have had a spouse and got divorced or been remarried. And as Paul deals with this, he is not here to condemn somebody for their marital status. He's not here to say you're doing it wrong. He's saying, God has you in this moment. Stay in it. And that's what he's getting at. Verse 10, But the married I give instructions, not only I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. But to the rest I say, not to the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband and consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through the believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. So he says, if you're a believer and your spouse is not, do not leave. And this is what was actually happening in the culture. Somebody would become a Christian, and then they would share Christ with their family, and that family would reject Christianity and say, no, we worship these gods, we worship all of these things, and the household would be divided. And Christians were leaving their spouses and leaving their families and everything and causing chaos. There was actually a higher divorce rate in Corinth, in that time period, looking at some of the evidence of how many people left their spouse by the Christian church more than the unchristian church. In our society, it's about 50-50, but believers were leaving their family. And Paul says, this is not good. It's not holy. And what it's doing is putting your kids in contention with culture of Corinth and Christianity. It is separating them from God. So they are not clean, they are holy if you remain. And so Paul is really saying the family will be saved. Now Jesus made a claim He did make this claim. He said, I did not come that a house would be united. He said it would divide a spouse. It would divide a father and a son and a daughter and a mother-in-law. It said this because the gospel is hated by the world. And I don't know if anybody's had an unbelieving spouse or any of that. I know one testimony of a lady that her husband was Hindu and she was not a believer in Christ. She used to attend here. And on his dying deathbed, he gave his life to Christ by her faithfulness to pray and to show Christ. So we see it still evident today that the faith of a believer can change the household. But as Paul is dealing with this, he says, don't be like the culture. Don't go and get divorced because you're not on the same level, because we know the scripture says be yoked and be equally yoked in other places. But this moment they weren't, because they weren't a Christian. They were already married. They became a Christian, and now they're dealing with this conflict. This is what is happening in the tension of the household, right? So Paul says the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her husband. It is amazing the witness that we get to be to those around us. We get to shine Christ starting in our own household, with our own families, just as Paul is saying here. And as he is discussing this, he's responding to all of these believers who said, we're married, but there's contention in our household, so it's better for us to be divorced and leave our family. God says, no. It is not better for this divorce. It is better to stay in this unity. Now, like I said, I'm not here to condemn marriage and divorce if you've ever been divorced, but hear this. God never intended divorce. He never set that up. He allowed it because he knew our wicked hearts. But Paul is saying the church has to be better and fighting all of these things that are going on in this culture. And so as he's saying this, Paul probably struggled with the same thing. His wife potentially left him when he started following Jesus. That's what a lot of scholars presume. Like I said, we don't know if she died or if she left. But Paul is dealing with this going, it is better to stay. Yet, in 15, if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage as such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Only as the Lord assigned each one, as God has called each in this manner, let him walk, and so I direct in all the churches. So in this moment he says, but if they want to leave you, you let them go. But you do everything to stay if they want to stay. This is a powerful moment. God calls us to peace. Anybody ever heard the phrase that we're supposed to be peacekeepers? That's a terrible phrase. God never says that about us. He says we are to be peacemakers. Peacekeepers is the way of the world. You don't talk about stuff, you sweep it under the rug, you just don't deal with things. But peacemakers bring about the goodness of God in the situation. Now, in this case, he's specifically dealing with the unbelieving and believing spouse. And he says, if they want to leave, you make peace by letting them leave. If they want to stay, you make peace by keeping them there. And this is a powerful thing to understand. Marriage is not slavery. It's not slavery. It is a free gift that God gives to humanity to represent the servanthood of Christ and the church. That's what Ephesians chapter 5 talks about. It is a picture that represents God. So he says, they are not under bondage. They're not a slave to you. They are free to go. Now, if it's two believers, it says there's a unity in this through Scripture, husband and wife becoming one flesh. And it represents a picture of God and his church, his bride. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He was not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called uncircumcised? Then he is not to be circumcised. Now he flips the argument a little bit. Whatever manner you were called, stay in this manner, to all the churches. And he goes from marriage to circumcision. And it seems weird to have both of these in the same text. But Paul is dealing with covenant. He is dealing with our relationship to God. Now, this is a weird one. I had to look this up because I was like, I don't understand this one. Every time I've read this passage and specifically get here, it says, don't let the uncircumcised become circumcised, and don't let the circumcised become uncircumcised. The one direction makes sense to me. The other did not. Like, how do you reattach something that's been cut off? And yet in their culture, to prove that they were a certain part of Christianity, they were doing things to their body, causing physical harm to them, trying to say, no, we're not circumcised. Yes, we are circumcised, and making a deal of it, right? This was an argument in the church that said, if we are not of this standard, then you can't really be a Christian. On the other side, it was, if you are of that standard, but you're not of this standard, you can't really be a Christian. Do you hear the paradox that's happening here in the culture? No matter how you came to Christ, if you were married, stay married. If you were under the Jewish covenant, stay under the Jewish covenant. But it doesn't mean you have to become that. So Paul brings this about covenant and purity in this moment. And circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, verse 19. But what matters is keeping the commandments of God. Which commandments? Do we keep all 613, as Kelly brought up in the previous sermon? Do we have to hold all 613 commandments of the Old Testament? I heard a no. Praise God. This was brought up in Sunday school with the youth. They said, are we still under the old covenant? Yes. The covenant really is a new covenant with Jesus, but it's been fulfilled through Christ. So we are not to do all of the things of the Old Testament, because we didn't get up, and I don't think anybody got up today and sacrificed a goat, did you? Or a lamb or a bull or a sheep. Okay, good. Praise God that you didn't, because Jesus is the sacrifice. So do the commandments of God. What are the greatest commandment? Love God, all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love. Man, what does that look like in our culture? Because if this is what they're dealing with in their culture, how do we uphold the commandments of God? To love people and to love God. The way we love God causes us to serve people. The way we serve people shows how we love God. And so in this moment, he says, do what matters. Keep the commandments of God. So you're dealing with a culture in Corinth that probably looks like the American culture today. People are mutilating their bodies for different purposes. They're worshiping things of whatever nature. They're falling for evil. They're committing sin and idolatry. They're leaving and doing different things. Our culture is no different than the Corinthian culture, except we had one advantage. We started with a culture that was worshiping God when this nation was founded. And we have digressed into cultural war, trying to fit in and look like the world. They started from a pagan society, and we're trying to figure out how to undo that and be a Christian society. We had the advantage, and yet we're losing that ground by choice. Because love is love, right? That's what the world wants you to know. Because it's your choice, and you should follow your heart, and you should have whatever you want, and you should be whatever you want. And God said, no. Paul's call here to remain as you are and to hold his commands is the same call that we need today in our culture. Verse 20, each man must remain in the condition in which he was called. Now, this is a weird verse because I was called when I was in sin. Should I remain in sin? Should I remain in sin? Oh, okay. You are awake. No. I was called in a condition I was in to follow Jesus. Now, I wasn't married when I met Christ, but I got married, so did I sin according to Paul? No. Right? It was probably the one that he was like, if you have a burning desire, find you a wife. And I did. But God called us for two purposes. In this moment, we are called to Him to turn away from the world, and then we are called to bring others to Him. This is a high calling. We change our life to be like Christ. As you were called, were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you're able to, become free. How many, slaves were like, yeah, I wish I could be free. Find a way, Paul says. But he says, don't worry about it. Rather, do that. For he who has called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. For he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. Let that sink in for a second. If you were a free person, nobody owns you, and Christ called you, he says, you're now my slave. Now you're in bondage. But if you were in bondage and Christ called you, he said, now you're free. And that seems weird. This whole chapter seems weird. But like I said, Paul is dealing with cultural norms that are not godly. And he's dealing with a church that is seeking the return of Christ and rejecting what they're supposed to be doing. Paul goes through later in parts of the text where he talks about people who are not working because they stopped working. Make them work again. All through his letters, like stop giving up your job, follow Christ, expect him to come. You are supposed to work, right? He gets into all of these arguments. If you are free, when you meet Christ, you are his slave. That doesn't sound pretty. Anybody want to be a slave to somebody else? Anybody volunteering? I don't think so. The same way he said, you're not a slave to your spouse, you are a slave to God. Because now he's saying, you are married, you are in covenant with God. You have become under his authority. This is everything that he's trying to unpack here. Remain where you were called, but if you were a slave, you are now free. If you weren't free, you are now a slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Think about this. God bought you with a price. The price of his son. The son who went to the cross, who was beaten, had his beard ripped out, had that cat of nine tails whipping him and pulling flesh, was strung up on a cross where they put him where he couldn't breathe and had to slide up and down. It was his life that paid for you. You're in debt. Not that you have to pay your debt off, but you're in debt because God said he called you into that. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. Where we fall into this slavery to God, we are actually freer than we ever were when we were not bound to Christ. We are free. You are bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. And this is interesting because Paul says, in our culture, when you turn to the pagan society, when you're doing the things of these people, you are a slave to these people. You're a slave to their ideology. You're a slave to this culture. You are not free. You better submit to everything they're doing, or be free in Christ and have his life, his resurrection, his ability to save you, redeem you, bring you through that, give you strength. Paul is really laying this out over all of the chapters in this book, and we're not going to go there, but as Kelly is going to continue to cover them, you will see this. You were bought. Brethren, each one is to remain with God in the condition he was called. Now concerning virgins, I have no commands of the Lord, but I will give an opinion of one by the mercy of the Lord that is trustworthy. You are to remain in the condition you were called. The condition is that you come to Christ, however you were, and then you serve him. And you honor him in that purity of making the choices that honor him, that bring the peace of God, that make the peace of God. You were bought. It's a price that we can't pay. It's a price that we don't deserve, but he gave it anyway. And then he switches topics. So he starts off with marriage. Be married, right? Stay faithful. If you're married, don't leave. right? If you're a widow, stay. If you're a slave, stay. If you're not, stay, right? He goes through all this, and then he gets to this conversation about daughters or virgins. And he says, now I'm going to speak to you about another subject. And it just seems like Paul is flipping his mind in this chapter to me. But here's the interesting thing. Women, although valued in the culture in some contexts, in the Corinthian culture were not valued. But where Christianity comes in, the value of women go up. But here's what happens in their culture. Did anybody have to pay a bridal price to get their bride? I didn't. I don't know if anybody still did that. If anybody's old enough, they had to pay some money. Paul's about to lay out this argument and saying, hey, it's still good for them not to get married because we want them to focus on Christ. But they could get married. He's going to lay this out in an interesting manner here as he's talking about these women, these virgins. He says, I've lost my spot. Let me go back. I give my opinion and is trustworthy. I think that it is good in view of the present distress, and this is verse 26, that it is good for a man to remain as he is, and as are you bound to a wife, do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife, do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. If you got married in the Corinthian culture, there was a problem being a Christian. They were being attacked. They were being persecuted. They were being separated from their family. So if you get married, I'm just trying to save you from this burden of loving your spouse and being pulled away from them, having a family and dealing with this culture that doesn't want you to be married, a culture that doesn't want you to follow God. I have such trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. But this I say, brethren, and I wrote something here. There you go. The time has been shortened, and from now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none. And those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. For the form of this world is passing away. Paul says, our days are shortened. Christ is coming. It's going to happen. If you're married, act like you're not. Now at the beginning he says, if you're married, stay married and be married and do the things that married people do. But now he's saying, don't. It's kind of weird. He gets into this. But the idea is, you were bought for Christ. So in everything you have, you still focus on Jesus. You still live this life for him. Be as one who does not rejoice, who once rejoiced. Do not be as one who has possessions, as they do not possess. And those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. For this form of this world is passing away. They were valuing the things of their culture and their world. Anybody been there? You have stuff that has you. I think it's probably easier in our culture now to say, instead of having idols and statues, we go, how much does your phone have you? How much does that doom scrolling have you? Right? How much of time do we waste on things that are not of God? And that's really where Paul's getting at. But I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord and how he may please the Lord. If you're single, you have all the time to think about God. If you're married, you have to think about your spouse. And if you have children, you have to think a lot about your children. Ladies, how many of you think about cooking all day long? I'm not saying men don't cook, but you thought, what are we going to have for breakfast for my children? What are we going to have for lunch for my children? What are we going to have for dinner for my children? Did you have a lot of time to pray and think about God when your kids were little and always hungry? Just get that in your mind for a second. I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. But one who is married is concerned about the things of this world and how he may please his wife. And his interests are divided. The woman who's unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, and she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Anybody realize that when somebody else is in your life, you have less time with God sometimes? You're like, I'm going to get up and I'm going to read my Bible. If you're like me, I like to get up early in the morning. I like to read my Bible. I get up, I start reading my Bible. There's 2 children in my house that will wake up before the sun rises on any day that I get up and want to read my Bible. And I have to no, we're not going to play. We're not going to turn on TV. No, we're not. It's Bible time. That's Berea and Hezekiah. They wake up regardless. And I've got other children that'll sleep till noon and never disturb my time then. But if I wanted to do something later in the day, guess who's going to disturb my time later in the day? Dassa, at midnight, if I'm still up, I've sent her to bed 1,000 times. Dad, I was just thinking. Okay. We are concerned with the things of this world. Those things of this world are not bad. Having a family is not bad. Being married is not bad. Having children is not bad. Thinking of others is not bad. But it distracts us from the Lord. Unless we can do those things and think of the Lord in that moment. Anybody ever say, I wish I had more time to read my Bible, but I don't because I've got work and I've got kids and I've got this and I got that and this event and that activity. And then you feel like, man, I wish I could have read, but Jesus, I'll visit with you tomorrow. I'm tired. Those are the hardest days of my life, is when everything is go, 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 and I forget to bring Jesus into it. And Paul is saying, you will have this contentious part of your life dealing with these things. If you're unmarried, you have all the time for the Lord. If you're married, you have to divide your time. If you have children, you really have to divide your time. Paul is saying, do the things of God in this chapter as he's been going through. This I say for your own benefit. Do not to put restraint upon you, but to promote what is appropriate and secure, undistracted devotion to the Lord. To promote what is appropriate and secure, undistracted devotion to the Lord. Do you have undistracted devotion to the Lord? Because I don't. But I have to force myself to have that devotion when God knows I need it, but my children need something. And I was watching my friend's video. He's a doctor. He's a famous TikToker now. I was watching his video last night, and he's unloading gravel, little pea gravel stuff to build a playground for his kid. It's 1 a.m. in his video as he's unloading this. And he's like, I've got lots of energy, and I'm doing the things that I love. I don't love this at the moment, but the kid I love, I'm doing this for. Do you find yourself devoted to things in times that you don't want to be because you love what the joy of that person receives? And Paul says, although you're distracted, may it be about securing undistracted devotion to the Lord. But if any man thinks he is acting unbecomingly towards his virgin daughter, now this is an interesting argument that he picks back up. If she is past her youth, and it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let her marry. But he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, has the authority over his own will, and decided that his own heart to keep his virgin daughter, he will do well. So in their culture, the husband, the father said, my daughter can marry, my daughter can't marry. But he's saying, in this I encourage you, if your daughter is of the age to be married, you don't sin. If she was a Christian and she was found like this and now she gets married. Or you don't sin if she stays this way because you're protecting her because Jesus is coming. That's his plan here. So then both who he gives his own virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if the husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God. As Paul goes through these different covenants, marriage, being united with Christ if you're an individual and you don't have a husband or a wife, if you're a slave, if you're a virgin daughter. He is literally saying, in our culture, we can either do the things of the world or we can do the things of God. We can have devotion to God or devotion to the things of the world. And he wants our heart to be focused on God. But he says there is nothing wrong with these things. And sometimes we need to hear that as Christians. There is nothing wrong with these things as long as they honor God. In other parts of this, he says, be holy because God is holy. We see that in 1 Peter. Be holy for God is holy. Whatever position God has called you to, do for his glory. Do for his kingdom. And like I said, he is fighting culture. He is fighting with Christians who are changing out of that culture. We're in a society where we need to stay out of that culture. We need to stay in the boundaries of God. Whatever he has called you to do it with undivided devotion to him. And that's what I want to encourage you with this morning. So as we continue this, and as Kelly will continue preaching, this is seeking the purity of our lives and our relationship with Christ.